Hey guys, this is Tyler here. It is end of March. I'm going to discuss here the difference between vacationing and living abroad and why you shouldn't get too caught up in news rankings and other rankings of countries, whether it's for living or traveling, especially if they're mainstream rankings, why you really have to read between the lines here. Okay, so I've spoken obviously about the studying, working, vacationing abroad, mostly for MGTOW guys, but for anyone here. And there's always a place for everyone to go to. That's the first thing I'll say here. But you have to understand that often people, when they look at countries, they look at it from the perspective of how it is on a vacation. If they're just enjoying the country for what it has to offer as a traveler, which is often very different than if you're in a country for long-term purposes. This is really critical to understand. Many people here know I lived in South America for a couple years. And if you go to South America to like travel or to visit, it's awesome. Awesome places. There's many cool countries to visit and you'll have a great time. Some of the countries are very affordable. But if you go with the purpose to live there, it can be quite different. And I know of so many stories that I've heard, I've spoken to people where they made a lot of misassumptions before they went on a trip or before they traveled. I've known of multiple girls from Russia, gals, when I was living over there, I had met, and they had some fantasies about Latin America. So like one, for example, she had met a Colombian guy. She went to South America and she had some grand ideals of what it was like or what she thought it was like. And then she went there and she only lasted for like 6 months. It was either Colombia or Venezuela. I think it was Colombia she went to. She's Russian and she ended up leaving. She broke up with her boyfriend at the time. She went there because of a boyfriend. And she realized it was nothing like what she anticipated. So she obviously was very much in this vacation mindset. And she also was probably in the mindset that she met a person, or she met a few people from Colombia, probably in Russia, and assumed, oh, this is a very cool experience, really like these people, not thinking that this is probably a very small representation of her country. Like I look at even myself from the States, I don't think, I've seen and I've spoken to a lot of people from the States. I've told people in countries I live, I don't think I'm a representation of a typical person from the U.S. Perhaps someone from the Rust Belt, from the Heartland, yeah, but not like the normie, I would say. I remember I had a friend, a roommate, very good friend. Him and his wife went and they lived in U.S. and Wisconsin for a few months. It was in 2014. It was like a summer work program that South America offered for these students, college students. And he went there and lived there. And I recall when he came back to the U.S., he told me, or when he went back to Chile, I was living in Chile at the time, in South America, him and his girlfriend said, like, man, you were like a lot different than what we were used to encountering in the States in many ways, and not in a good way, mind you. And I was not surprised when he told me this, because people, they meet some people, and often too, the people they're meeting in those countries, if someone's traveling to a country to visit or to live, it's probably not the norm. They probably don't have the normal characteristics of someone that wants to live and reside in their home countries. Of course, there's good people and that travel and live abroad, and there also that live at home. And there's also bad people, of course. You got to remember that if you're vacationing somewhere, it's really different than if you're like traveling somewhere for the purpose to like work, to possibly marry and have a family. I know a lot of people here aren't interested in those last two that I mentioned, but there are some. Also just to be able to live long term in a country, because you may see a country and often what you'll find is that the more of a novelty you are in that country, the more difficult it probably will be long term to live there. So I think you have to kind of find a balance. If you're completely considered a normie in that country, probably going to be more difficult. But if you're something in between, not too exotic but not too foreign, if that make, or not too exotic or not too domestic, if that makes sense, you probably will find an adjustment. Like when I went from South America to living in Eastern Europe, even when I lived over in Russia, but especially here in Estonia, almost any given day, most people, unless they start speaking to me, they don't even know that I'm not Estonian. That has obviously pluses and minuses. In this country, I prefer that, absolutely. And I know of other foreign guys here, and I think more of them generally, they would prefer if they were a little more similar looking to people here. They don't dislike who they are. I'm just saying that for the sake of like this country, it would be a little more comfortable for them. And so people, obviously, there's many guys now that want to go to Southeast Asia, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, and they look at like it from like the films and from books and television, everything, and they also see videos, and it can look a lot different also how a video portrays something a lot more exciting, and also when it's short term, it's very condensed. Then when you go for a very extended time, I knew a guy actually I worked with, he was a client of mine, and he actually went to Albania. Now he's in Ukraine, but he was only in Albania, I think, for a few weeks. He got so tired of it in Albania. And there were a few main factors, and we had discussed some of these countries before he departed. And I didn't know a lot about Albania, but I kind of just cautioned him that you may want to be careful. What you're seeing in videos, I think, is maybe not very representative of what it's going to be like to actually live there. Relocated to Ukraine, and he seems very content now being in Ukraine, residing longer term. And you may go, say, to Eastern Europe. You may have an effect where you go to an Eastern European country. Short term, it may not seem very nice or very pleasant, or maybe as fun, as exciting or adventurous. But then when you spend more time there, it actually is more comfortable for a long-term situation. We obviously saw with this whole pandemic situation that you kind of got an idea of what a country was like at its worst. And I've spoken about this before, that you want to evaluate a country when it's at its worst, not when it's at its best time frame. Do they force you to constantly wear a face covering? Do they tell you, like, we have curfews, we have lockdowns, we have every other thing that countries have been doing the past year? There you can see what the real outlook of the country long term is, 10, 20 plus years. And you got to realize that if you're living somewhere long term, those are going to be situations you have to deal with. You have to, if you have phone bill or internet, you have to go and pay that. How easy is that to do? Can you do it online? I know in Philippines, I saw a guy, he lives there, an expat, and he was saying that over there's many shops in certain parts of the Philippines provinces where you need the exact amount of cash, Philippine dollars, to pay for things at like a convenience store or like a real small vendor. They don't often even have enough change. This is crazy. That seems very primitive. This is the kind of day-to-day thing you deal with, and over time that obviously can get really difficult and just troublesome to deal with. And of course, in Asia is notorious for often not allowing foreigners to own land. They may be able to own property, not own land. In some cases, they can't solely own even the property. You can't have like a title in your name. I know Philippines is an example. Maybe that won't seem like a big deal short term, but long term, especially when you put more time in a country. Just think if you come from Germany or come from the US or Australia and you live somewhere and you put in your time, like after 20 years, especially if you constructed your own house, wouldn't you want to have that title in your name or that land, especially if you're using the land to cultivate for animals, for livestock, for vegetables, or have your own gardens and whatever it is, leasing it? You probably want it to be in your name, and for that not to even be under your authority, it seems crazy. But that's things you have to think about if you're if you're going to be long-term in a country. It's very different than short-term. There's some countries that are awesome for short-term versus long-term. And that's also, too, we see these rankings of these countries. There's so many factors that come into play. There's a few things, so I think you should first note that. Are they asking these people like rank for these ranking of countries? Yeah, I think they are. But the people that are responding are probably within a certain demographic or typical profile. I think also it tends to be a lot more women expats that they're asking for these rankings of these countries. There's a really good test. I've spoken to this with some friends of my brother. If you want to see for a guy, especially like a bad country, you look at a Huffington Post ranking, and if they rank certain countries or cities really high, it's probably not a very good country if you're a guy, especially if you're trying to date or just for liberties. You'll see these lists and it's just, you can't really figure it out. And then there's other countries or cities they don't have on those lists. And so just remember that, do the opposite of whatever the Huffington Post ranking says. But so they're asking these people, and I think it's a certain class of people that's responding. Also note that more expats, especially from the US, from England, Australia, that are living abroad typically are more liberal. It's often very liberal. And I'm definitely not in that category. Some people here probably already know that. These are not probably guys like you watching this channel. They're people that have very different ideals on the world and different mindset in these countries. So you got to be careful when you read into these rankings to look at the factors and look what goes into it. Philippines got a lot of flack a few years ago with their new president. Then you look at what he stood for and his ideologies and stuff, and I personally agree with many of the things he stood for. And mainstream, of course, didn't, but they all have political agendas. These mainstream outlets push what they want for a certain narrative. Also, obviously, go to a country because you personally want to. Don't go because you're going for the sake of a girlfriend, going for anyone. You wouldn't go because you like it. Many guys go somewhere, they met a girlfriend, and they totally relocate. They live up their life. If it's going to result in something permanent, marriage or kids, understandable. But if you're simply going for that alone, it's probably not worth it. The guys often I know in Estonia that do that are the ones that are the most uncomfortable here. The guys that don't have that situation actually are probably more comfortable, ironically. You have to take that in consideration. But look at each country and see what works. And if it's best just to stay at home, stay in your home country. So give me your feedback below, and thank you.